to our panel on the art of pitching. We have some amazing, brilliant women here to share their perspectives on the art of pitching. They'll tell you a little bit about their backgrounds as well as what it means to pitch to them and experience pitching in their careers. But we want to start off with a huge thank you to the Kendra Scott Women's Entrepreneurial Leadership Institute for hosting this panel. And so we're looking forward to having you all as part of the conversation on our International Women's Day. So we'll kick things off with our introductions and then go through our questions. Lauren, I'm going to kick it over to you to do your introduction so everyone can meet you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been so exciting to be a part of this panel. I'm really excited to jump into something that I personally love and love to share my experience with. So my name is Lauren. I am the co-founder and CEO of Funder. And Funder is a platform that is using AI to remove bias from the investing process, to connect investors with founders, and then to help people who are normally overlooked in the investment process get access to funding. And then I'll say in terms of what pitching means to me personally, it's really about finding a concise way to sell your idea or yourself or your company to any interested party. So anyone that you're trying to work with, I think that could be investors, it could be a sales meeting, it could be partners, it could be even people who come to work for your company. Anytime that you're trying to sell who you are, to me is pitching.
Wonderful. Lauren, thanks so much. Kim, you're up next.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kim Barnes, and my company that I own and founded is Barnes T Media. And we help people with their ability to be more comfortable and confident on camera so they can do videos or virtual presentations or meetings or media interviews. And we also work with people on their overall communication skills because it's so important so that they can share their message with more impact and more effectiveness. And when I think of pitching, it goes back to my days of my background as a news reporter and news anchor that I did that for 15 years. And then I've continued to do on-air work since then. But when I first think of pitching, I think of being in the newsroom and getting those pitches that come in from PR agencies and people that want news coverage and being able to look at them and see, okay, this one sounds interesting, and then this one does not. And so really, what are the ways that we can make people interested enough so that the news will want to cover it? And that's just one form. But in my business life and in some of the sales roles that I've had as well, you do so much pitching with potential clients as well as potential partners. And you're having to really try to figure out who's my audience and what is it that will be interesting to them and how do I fit into that? And really using all of that together to figure out how can we create these partnerships and or get new clients. So I think pitching is part of our everyday life. And, frankly, as a mom, you also pitch a lot too when you're trying to get your kids to eat their vegetables. So, there's pitching comes in all forms.
Absolutely. Kids and pets, right? Marissa, you're up next.
Hi, thank you for having me. My name is Marissa. I am co-founder and president of a company called Otso. We are a fintech product in commercial real estate leasing. So essentially, we replace the need for businesses to put down cash deposits when they lease a space. My experience with pitching lately has been more on the sales side, but I also have a background and did a lot of pitching for investment for my company when we started. And just like the other lady said, pitching has come in and out of my life in various ways. I think as long as you have some sort of a vision, whether, like Kim said, you're a mother, or in my earlier career, I was in the military, leading people, having to have them buy in on what you are doing as a leader. Pitching comes in various ways. Again, most recently, it's mostly sales today.
Thanks, Marissa. And then Anna, you're up next.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me, Melissa. So I'm Anna Robinson. I founded Sarisa just about 3 years ago, and Sarisa is a leadership platform that is designed to support diverse humans who are also aspiring leaders. And we work mostly B2B, mostly with companies, so supporting them as they try to support and grow their diverse talent. So pitching, I think, probably takes up a good 80% of my waking hours, maybe even a portion of my dreams, if I'm totally honest. And it takes so many forms. So in a former life, I was a partner at McKinsey, a global consulting firm. And so there it was a little bit more business development like, as opposed to sales pitch, where it was more about developing relationships, but it was still at the heart of it, pitching, which to me is about inspiring people to believe in you, in your idea, in your product, so that they will take action. And the second part's pretty important because it's easy to pitch someone to say yes, but actually to take an action is different. And for me today, that is primarily sales plus investors. So we've raised 3 million in seed funding in about the last 12 months. But I think the team is a super important component, not just when you're hiring new people to the team, but actually to keep your whole team inspired and believing in the bigger picture, particularly for really early stage companies. And I would list my husband to the list of personal people that I have to pitch on a regular basis.
I'll take it. And I would add my students. I'm pitching my students on a daily basis as well. So wonderful. Welcome, panelists. Thank you so much for joining us. So we're going to get into our questions. We've talked a little bit about the purposes of a pitch, kind of the common formats that we have. Interested to hear maybe a little bit more about that, but how do you get started? Our audience here is really curious. They're just starting an entrepreneurial journey or they're just starting their careers. They don't even know what they don't know.
Well, I was going to say, I really love what Anna said in terms of moving someone to action. And I think the first way to start is to understand your audience. Who are you talking to? Because even though the story of yourself and the story of your company is likely going to be similar, that ask is probably going to be different. And then how you're presenting information and data and all of that is going to change depending on what context you're in. So for example, when I'm talking to an investor, I'm not going to pitch the company in the same way as when I'm talking to a user and someone who wants to come and join the site, right? You have to understand what their motivations are. You have to understand what they want to get out of it and what you can bring to that relationship. So I think that's the first place to start.
And I'll add on to that, Lauren, is when, especially if you're an entrepreneur starting out, I'd say pitching your idea and your business is especially experimental because, you know, the way you are communicating it and the way you understand it in your head as a founder is not always how it resonates with the customer or the user. And so I've probably done for my company in the last 5 years over hundreds of pitch decks, evolving that message and seeing what resonates with those people. And from an investor standpoint, and I'll just kind of like stick to that because that's what I've mostly been doing in the last few years. It's even different depending on where in the country that investor is. Some investors on the West Coast like to see different numbers. Central can be different. And so the importance of catering to who is looking at what you're pitching or your deck and what they're looking for is extremely important as well.
Just with storytelling, right? It's not just one story that you're going to tell. You're going to tell multiple stories throughout your life. And so pitches are constantly evolving and they're different lengths. Like you can do a 1-minute elevator pitch to a 15-minute investor deck to like a half a day retreat with investors pitching your ideas and a number of different formats. But the key there is really understanding your audience. So thank you for that perspective. As I've mentioned to you all earlier, my dissertation, what I was interested in as a graduate student was storytelling, because everywhere that I went where there was entrepreneurs incubating and accelerating, I would hear this feedback of, well, just tell your story when you're pitching your ideas. That was the question that I studied for 2 years to understand how does storytelling impact entrepreneurs' success in crowdfunding campaigns specifically, but in the art of pitching as a whole. You know, what is the influence of storytelling there? What does it mean to tell your story? And really, ultimately, what does it take to make a pitch successful?
Well, I'll jump in. Just as a former reporter, we know as a reporter that people remember stories, and that makes it really relatable to people. So whether it's your own personal story or even the story of another person, a potential client or customer that you've had, or that you hope to have, being able to help the other people see that, it just helps them remember it and it helps them relate to it better. You know, I think about the stories that I used to do as a news reporter where I'd have to talk about, you know, property taxes. Well, all those numbers don't necessarily mean as much as hearing the story of a woman who's lived in her house for 50 years, who's on a fixed income, who's going to lose her home now. You know, those are the kinds of things that not only can pull at those emotional heartstrings, but it just makes it makes it relatable. It doesn't make it just data on a spreadsheet. And while that's all really important, and especially when you have investors, stories are what people remember and what they can relate to.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's a balance I see as well, you know, particularly in investor meetings. I think it's true for sales conversations as well, of understanding, like we said already, who you're talking to so that you can tailor a little bit your messaging and have a slightly different version of your pitch, whether that's a formal presentation or just an informal conversation based on the person. And by the way, just on that topic, I think everyone assumes a pitch is you speaking, whereas I have found time and time again, the more you get the other person talking in a pitch, the better. Getting information for them up front, like what's the most important things to you? You know, what are your biggest challenges at the moment? Helps you even in the moment to tailor the pitch. Flip side of tailoring your story for every person you're meeting or every different audience is not moving away too far from authentically who you are and actually what your concept is. And I think at times I have over pivoted towards, oh, well, it's this kind of investor, so therefore I've got to tell this story. And I was given some advice recently, particularly as we look at our Series A, of actually you don't want 50 investors saying yes. You want 5 investors who are completely behind you in your future vision of what the world's going to be and why you are the solution for that. So the people who really resonate with your story, and sure, you might tweak it slightly, but that's actually who you want to appeal to, as opposed to trying to appeal to everybody, but suddenly you're not really clear on who you are, what your focus is. So there's some balance there. And the only other thing on storytelling I was going to say was, you know, we talk a lot about pitching the story, pitching the idea, pitching the product. I have found that in a lot of investor meetings, your personal story is important too, especially in earlier stages of a company before you have a whole ton of product or proof points to show that they care a lot about. People will literally ask you, why did you start this company? You know, where did this idea come from? How did you and your co-founder meet? So being able to talk about that credibly and frankly be comfortable doing it is an important step as well.
Yeah, because they're really investing in you as much as they are in your idea.
Yes. I literally have one investor, I won't say too many details, but he said to me at one point, you know, I'm not sure about the idea. My co-founder is Nicole. He said, but really, this is just the Anna and Nicole show. And that's what he's investing in. I was like, well, I think that's flattering. I'm not totally sure, but yeah, it's a big part of it.
Yeah, the individuals that invest in your pre-seed, your kind of really, really early stage companies will tell you that they're looking at the founders more in some cases than the actual idea, because anyone that started a company knows that it shifts and that what they're pitching you today could shift. My company has evolved from a previous idea. And so they want to know, what's your background? Do you have that grit to stay in and see this as a success?
I'm so glad to hear all of those perspectives, because that's one of the big teaching moments I have, or that I try to tell my students, and that is that they don't bet on the horse, they bet on the jockey in many cases. And that seems to resonate with a lot of people, as well as the fact that it wasn't just one story. When I was exploring the idea of storytelling and raising money as an entrepreneur, it's actually multiple stories that you're telling. And it's the story of how you founded the company. It's the story of your first customer experience. It's the story of your market validation. And there's multiple stories that you're building over your career pitching. So I think that's a really important point that's not often covered, especially when you're first starting out as an entrepreneur. You're so overwhelmed with this idea of this one big story. And I found in my own research that it's actually multiple stories.
On that point as well, I feel like there's a part of pitching that happens without you in the room. Like you learn that, oh, they went and talked to a customer of yours, or they did some networking and found out about you from people. So also having your story told by your users in your community is actually a really important sort of sub-component of your overall pitch.
Absolutely. And that's something I studied was how viral these stories can go. And that's how we know that they're successful, when there is research to suggest that stories are remembered 22 times more than facts, and it's easier for people to repeat them to other audiences for them to learn about you.
And from a woman's perspective too, it's important to be confident in talking about yourself and, you know, touting your accomplishments. That's something I didn't do early on, is that my concern was more so, will these investors see my industry experience as, you know, valid? Whereas most of them actually cared. I went to West Point. I was a combat veteran. They wanted to know that stuff a little bit more, and carried, especially earlier on, like more weight to some of these folks. And some of the initial meetings, I didn't even mention some of that stuff. And my co-founder, who's a man, telling me, hey, you really need to to mention that, early on.
So let's talk a little bit about what makes pitches successful. And oftentimes when we talk about this, we talk about it from a content perspective and we talk about it from a delivery perspective. And of course, depending on the audience, the content is a little bit different. But on this theme of what makes pitches successful and things that you see, many of you have listened to pitches throughout the years. What do people do really well and what's successful and what are some mistakes that you see?
Yeah, I think that Marissa nailed it. I think talking about how you're going to bring this idea to fruition, why you are the right person for whatever the venture is, and then talking about your traction. So traction can be any kind of progress that you've made over time, right? Is it users? Is it revenue? Is it investment, getting into a great accelerator, incubator? And these are very entrepreneur startup specific ways of building traction. But I think for a lot of women, they tend to shy away from that because I don't think that we were raised to talk about how great we are. And I think that's a huge piece of being successful, is to be able to tout your own accomplishments as well as the things you've been able to build as a team. That's what a leader does, right? And that's what they're looking for. And then the second piece I would say is your ask. And so many people leave that out. They'll get to the end and they'll just say, thank you. And what are you asking for? What are you pitching me on? Don't forget to ask, and don't be afraid to ask, particularly when it comes to money, because I think a lot of women are also afraid to ask for money, ask what they're worth. And so don't be afraid to do that at the end. People are waiting for that so that they can give you feedback and say yes or no. And you'd be surprised how much you'll get by just asking that question, asking for what you want.
From a presentation perspective, you'd mentioned kind of what do you look for. There's different environments. So like Anna said earlier, there's kind of like that one-on-one in a room meeting that we'll have with investors or customers. And she's absolutely right. I experienced the same thing, that my best pitches in small rooms with individuals has been where they're asking the questions and you're leading them in to seeing that solution. They're talking almost more than you because you see that interest. I love just like kind of walking out of the room and being like, they kind of fell into every trap, not trapped, but they asked every question that I led them to ask. From another perspective of pitching that I've done as well is just kind of this more formal presentation in front of a crowd. What I've seen, successful people do, it really does. That is where the storytelling and the confidence and the charisma really comes into play with presenting. It's a different presentation than in a small room. But I think from a mistake standpoint, you had mentioned, Melissa, some of the ones I've experienced myself is just like using the right vernacular. Like early on, when I talk about my industry and I talk about lease securitization and collateralization, y'all have no idea what I'm talking about. But when I say businesses have to put security deposits down, y'all can relate to that. And so making sure that the terms that you're using, is it an industry specific room or is it more of just kind of normal people that don't understand your industry? That goes back to that knowing your audience.
Yeah, and building on that, Marissa, I was thinking about how important it is to know in advance what they care about. And I think there's a bit of a gender difference here. And frankly, it would be true if we look at some other diversity statistics as well, where having the confidence to reach out in advance and build a relationship before you're actually going to make an ask. So like now, just to give a real example, we've raised our seed round. We're going to be raising a Series A probably within 12 months. So we are now, even though we literally just closed our funding of the last 3 million, are having conversations with new investors and saying, hey, here's what we do. We don't really want to talk so much about us. What does a great Series A look like to you? What metrics do you care about? What is the absolutely most critical metric to you that if you don't have this, there's no conversation, so that we build that relationship, stay in touch with them. So by the point we're actually pitching, we know the 5 things they're going to be asking us, they're going to care about. And frankly, we get to control the narrative because now we get to say, hey, here are the 5 things you said. Here's how we're doing on those metrics. What do you think? So it changes it a little bit. And it's the same, for example, when you're interviewing for a job, right? Somebody who already knows people who work at that company or that firm are going to reach out to them and say, what should I expect in the interview? For me personally, I know we were all talking about this before we went live on the panel. In my 20s and 30s, I had so many insecurities and really lacked confidence for what I probably should have had. And I feel like so much of that has gone away, especially now I'm in my 40s. Come on, I earned every gray hair here. But I'm telling you, the minute I walk into a room that's like a formal investor meeting, all of that rises up to the top. And there's something about the power imbalance. And I'm still working on how do I go into these rooms realizing that I'm offering them something. Yes, I'm asking for something, but I'm actually giving them a great opportunity. For me, understanding what they're going to look for gives me a little bit more confidence before I go into the room, that I understand it better, that, you know, I'm not going to have that same reaction in that setting, particularly as a woman, particularly in the venture world where it tends to be quite male dominated. It's the kind of dynamic that we all read about and know about.
And to add on what Anna said, I felt the same way with the vulnerability and the fear going into this with, you know, despite my kind of previous accomplishments in my career. It's really, there's a lot of vulnerability going into when you know that, and you should expect that most of the time you go into these investment meetings, most of them will say no. And dealing with someone saying no to you is really hard. And that was really hard in the beginning for me. And going back to the pitch perspective is, despite whatever happening and whatever questions, my co-founder and I, like, our whole kind of agreement is, as long as we walk out of the room and we feel strongly that they knew that we knew what we were talking about, that's a win, whether they say yes or no. Kind of like getting into that mindset of expecting, you know, not everybody's for you. It's almost like dating to an extent.
Absolutely. We make that comparison a lot when pitching yourself in an interview and networking. But Kim, I'm looking at you as far as delivery. What makes for successful delivery, or alternatively, sometimes we learn best from learning what not to do. So what perspective can you share with us on the more technical aspect?
Well, I think in many ways, the more you can set yourself up for success, knowing the ways that are going to make you come across better are going to build your confidence, because then you walk into that room, hopefully with a little more confidence. You know, when you're on camera, when you know the things, especially if you're going to be virtual and having to do virtual presentations and virtual pitches, which I think are going to be a part of our world potentially forever because it's so convenient. So knowing all those things about how am I showing up, and am I showing up in the way that I would want? Biggest mistakes are if your background and your audio and your lighting is poor, it just takes away or it becomes a distraction so that they can't really focus on you. You know, you want them focused on what you're saying and what your message is. Another thing that's really important is thinking about the things that you're saying without ever saying a word. Meaning all of those nonverbal cues that you're sharing, whether it's your body language, your facial expressions, the tone of voice that you use, but really being aware of, am I coming across in the way that I intend? And I think another mistake that sometimes people make is being so focused on the words and on every single word being in a specific order. And while, especially in an investor pitch, they want to know all those facts and figures are correct. And so there are some words that are very, very important. But, you know, I often say that if you watch an inexperienced or young reporter, sometimes you'll notice that it almost looks like they're reading their eyelids because they are so focused on having memorized something that then all emotion gets lost. Everything, our passion comes through our eyes. And so if you, especially when it's your idea that you're pitching, you obviously have such a passion for it and wanting to make sure you can do everything you can to make sure that the other people can feel that passion too. And that you don't have just that kind of glazed look because you're so focused on, okay, what's the next thing? What's the next thing? And what's the next thing? And certainly being prepared and having a plan ahead of time is going to help, again, build your confidence so that you walk in knowing that you've done everything you can. And just as Marissa said, that you know, when you can walk out feeling like, okay, I did my very best. This may not be the right investor for me. I know that I was able to share the information that I needed to share in a way that they were able to hear me in the authentic way that I want them to.
Absolutely. And y'all are so well spoken. I mean, just even volume being really important in communicating confidence, that you believe in yourself and speaking with conviction and avoiding those filler words, and words being very important, especially as somebody who studied so much communication. One of the things that I tell a lot of my students who are very nervous in giving presentations or pitches in the classroom is people very rarely remember what you say, and they remember how you make them feel. And so it's not this word in this exact order and memorizing. It actually will make you more nervous. We've all been there where we've seen somebody stall out who's tried to memorize and kind of take that control over their nerves. It's one of those things that you've got to get used to in your central nervous system. You've got to practice so you can control that fight or flight. That's something that I can can add to that conversation on delivery, since this is I grade presentations all the time, and I'm focusing a lot on delivery. And a lot of the research will say is that 80% of the message is in the nonverbal communication and body language.
Because once you miss that word, once you get to that word and you forget it, not only is your brain still thinking, oh shoot, what was the word I was supposed to say? And your mouth is still trying to say new words. You can't think of that many things at the same time. And it just can go downhill really fast.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I tell clients all the time is you also have to remember that unless you've given them your kind of outline or your script, they don't know what you're planning to say. So if you say it a little bit differently, but still get the same gist out, it's okay.
Yes. Love that. I love that advice. So as we're wrapping up and thinking about the art of pitching, go kind of around round robin here. What resources can you share for entrepreneurs starting their journey?
I have a few. So in terms of books, I read a book called Get Backed. That was really good. And it talks about different ways. And this is specific to startup decks and pitch decks, but it's a really great way to understand how to build your story out in that form. And then I would say other resources are really lean on other entrepreneurs. There's Beam here in Austin, which is an incredible network, and they have a number of classes around this. Black Women Talk Tech, which is an organization I founded years ago, where we bring Black women founders together. When you can practice your pitch with other people who are invested in what you're doing and who understand what you're pitching, that will help you incredibly. So make sure that you lean on other people that you can practice this with to make sure that they understand what you're pitching and they get out of it what you want them to.
Building on that, to me, practice is just the most important thing. There's, like you said, there's lots of good resources locally in Austin, but also if you even literally Google it, there's so many great resources on VCs' websites and stuff like that help you even put together a pitch deck. But to me, like so much of it is about practice, and that might be practicing with your co-founder, it might be practicing with fellow entrepreneurs. Frankly, a lot of it is just getting in the room and practicing. So one piece of advice I was given was don't go to your top target investors first. Work your way up to them, because you're going to get better and more comfortable. It's the same with public speaking as well. You know, the more you do it, those nerves start to turn into excitement and you start to feel it, but in a different way. So I think a lot of it's just making it happen. And if a friend asks you what you're working on, that's a practice opportunity to pitch your elevator pitch. And every time you say it, I think it gets a little bit easier and you feel it more. And so it becomes easier and easier to talk about it over time.
One little trick that we share all the time, and this is especially when you're going to have to be on camera, but I think it works in general, is just get your phone out and turn on the video camera and just talk to it every day and just watch it back. And it can be what you had for breakfast. It could be what you're doing that day. It could be specific to maybe a topic that you want to cover on maybe what your pitch is going to be about. But just getting used to communicating is so, so important. And you can watch that back just for feedback, not to be critical, because we're all going to be, you know, our worst critics, but just get information. Do you realize, oh gosh, I do this all the time, or my eyes dart around when I don't know what I'm saying, or different things like that might be unique to being on camera, but chances are it can also be pretty telling to the way you're interacting with people one-on-one as well, or in a group. So just record yourself and watch it back, and then you can delete it.
And I'll add one more thing. Lauren mentioned Get Backed. That book was amazing and really helped us kind of shape our pitch deck when we were fundraising. For like the more formal pitches, I would watch winners on YouTube that had won various competitions and kind of see what they had on their slides or what topics they talked about to win those competitions. I think though the biggest thing for me was pitching a kid. So I have like younger cousins and nephews and nieces, and I found that I would practice pitching them the idea and having them repeat it back to me. And mind you, I'm in commercial real estate. Like a high school kid doesn't care any less about anything. So commercial real estate, but practicing in front of kids and having them regurgitate it back, you know, clearly you're like, okay, if you could pitch to them, you could pitch to any investor and get them to understand it.
That's a great idea.
I love that idea of pitching to kids or grandparents. Y'all, this wraps up our amazing panel on the art of pitching. And you've heard from all of these panelists who've had years and years of experience to share with you today, as well as like their best piece of advice and takeaway for you as you move forward with your careers and your ideas. So we encourage you to visit the other panels for today's recording for International Women's Day. There's a lot of really good information and resources. So many women here in the Austin area that are here to support you in your journeys. Thanks so much for tuning in. Bye, y'all.